Hello and welcome to a new episode of our weekly show, Global Insight. I'm your host, Hasan. 2.7% of the world GDP is spent on military expenditure worldwide. The US can guarantee military bases in the UAE for selling F-16s, and they can turn a blind eye to extreme violence because they are able to set up bases in such a key geopolitical location. The arms race leads to ignoring democracy and human rights to achieve foreign policy objectives. While the major powers call for democracy and peaceful solutions of conflicts, they keep on supplying arms to the conflicting countries and consequently triggering more violence. The UN has long called for a creative partnership with the arms industry, saying that such an arrangement would help promote greater transparency and help control illegitimate arms trafficking. Can arms supply be justified politically? How can peaceful resolutions be called for while the superpowers are in a state of arms race? What are the repercussions of arms race on the continued unrest in the Arab world? Deep insights about these questions, among many others, will be probed with our guest in the studio, Dr. George Labaky. Dr. George Labaky, I'm glad to have you in the studio. You are a political analyst and a political science professor at Notre Dame University. And I'll be joined with a link from Beirut with General Hicham Jaber, who is a political analyst as well. General Jaber, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I do.
I highly appreciate your presence with us tonight, despite the eye injury which you've had recently. Hello again. Before shedding lights on the questions which I've mentioned, we'll go with a report about arms race, and then we will start our discussion.
The arms race has recently escalated to become a major index in the world trade and economy. It is estimated that yearly over $1.5 trillion are spent on military expenditures worldwide, constituting 2.7% of the world gross domestic product. The arms industry is nearly monopolized by 2 or 3 major suppliers whose sales target mainly the developing countries, mainly in the Middle East and Asia. The irony stands in the fact that the top 5 countries profiting from the arms trade are the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council: the USA, UK, France, Russia, and China. Selling arms can help countries achieve their geopolitical and strategic interests. For instance, several years ago, the United States had agreed to sell 80 advanced F-16s to the United Arab Emirates. The deal was estimated to be around $15 billion. In return, the US was granted the right to build military bases there with improved access to the only deep-water port capable of housing carriers in the Persian Gulf. The resulting stability in the region was jeopardized. Another example is the many US weapons sold to Turkey. The US turns a blind eye to these atrocities because they are able to set up bases in such key geopolitical locations. Many critics say that the arms race leads to ignoring democracy and human rights, especially that the arms deals are often lucrative and help promote US foreign policy objectives. This indirectly leads to the repression, fanaticism, and extremism in many regions in the world, especially the Middle East and Asia. Another incident illustrating double standards in dealing with human rights was disclosed by the New York Times. The US-based newspaper noted that China has been suspected of flouting international sanctions and selling arms to countries such as Libya, Sudan, and others that are involved in conflicts. The US continued with a partial sale arms to Bahrain despite Bahrain's violent suppression against protesters. On another level, the UN has long called for a creative partnership with the arms industry, saying that such an arrangement would help promote greater transparency, help control illegitimate arms trafficking, and ensure legitimate use of the purchased weapons. However, the extent to which such initiatives and partnerships are being implemented is characterized by skepticism. Is the US in the first place in this race? When would the finish line appear?
Hello again to Global Insight. Dr. George Labaky. As per the report and the introduction, 2.7% of the world gross domestic product is spent on military expenditure. And hence we are having an arms race since the Cold War and afterwards as well. What are the underlying reasons or the main justifications in general for such an arms race?
I think, first of all, when you have lucrative return, you have always interests that come first before ideals and standards and moral values. On the other hand, it's very obvious that international relations are based on law and on interests. So the third point, the armed lobby is very powerful politically in the United States, in Europe, everywhere.
It's a cartel, maybe.
Yes,
if you want to
let's put it as a political lobby that is very powerful. Those three conditions are enough to underlook the issues of human rights and people rights of self-determination.
So such countries perceive the arms race from a utilitarian approach. They look at the cost-benefit analysis. They see that the benefit offsets the cost. That's why they might go to that extreme in their arms race.
There is a French proverb that says, we lend only to rich people. So if you have rich countries, they are the most important for superpowers. Also, even as your report has mentioned, even poor countries have been strained. One of the reasons of the financial problems of Greece is the fact that Greece has spent a lot of money buying arms from France, which has increased the public debt to the GDP. So poor or rich, finally, they are pushed under a lot of reasons, including regional conflicts, sometimes internal conflicts, to buy arms, and sellers are eager to sell.
Definitely, whenever there is a demand, and the demand is high regardless of the justification. Dr. General Jaber, in fact, I'd like to have your perspective from a military aspect. What are the justifications for such arms race?
And first of all, we have to say that every country, any country, when they start to make a strategic defense plan or strategic offensive plan, for example, let's say, they have to look who is the potential enemy. And the potential enemy is supposed to be another country. And now there is another enemy, interior enemy, for many countries in the world, which is who is the terrorism. Now, we look to the Arab countries, for example, especially the Gulf countries, who did buy in the last 3 decades more than $600 billion weapons. Saudi Arabia alone did pay $400 billion in the last 3 decades. And I do remember a friend of mine, a general, Syrian general, who told me that Gaddafi did buy 4,000 tanks in the late 70s and in the 80s, maybe from Soviet Union, and 4,000 tanks for an army who doesn't have 25,000 soldiers. And if you want to buy one tank, for one tank, you need 15 soldiers, 5. So imagine how did pay all the Arab countries, Gaddafi on one hand and other countries who used to buy from Soviet Union, then the Gulf countries who did pay for $600 billion to the Western countries. Who is the potential enemy? The question. The potential enemy, if the potential enemy is supposed to be Israel for the Arab countries, all those weapons are not useful against Israel because Israel has more sophisticated weapons.
And
we
maybe
will talk
in
about
in
it
many
later.
incidents, the war is with Israel can be a guerrilla warfare. You can be so that if
Yes,
you're not
yes.
at the same level with in
Yes,
terms
yes.
of militarization with
Yeah,
Israel.
yeah.
Yeah.
Only the resistance in Lebanon used guerrilla warfare. All Arab armies, classical armies, you know, are not supposed to face the Israeli army, who is much more sophisticated.
Sophisticated,
I
yeah.
don't mean that the Israeli are better, you know, as a soldier or officers at all, but they do have
From
the
a
Israeli
technological perspective, you're
technological
talking.
point of view, something, you know, over, you know, we're talking about airplanes or aircraft or even tanks or whatever, or artillery, you know, they have the most sophisticated
Yeah,
ones.
yeah, sure.
So I am talking now about Arab, as you said, no, arms race, and I am taking an example. The Arabs paid in the last 4 decades, when Iraq, Saddam Hussein also started, you know, the war, more than 1 trillion, 800 billion, you know, to 1 trillion dollars. And I think, you know, it's a big amount of money. Where are those weapons now? And also I have to say, and I was listening to your report, that arms race or arms market is not only for economic profit.
Definitely.
It's strategic and political, and its influence, because when you sell weapons, you sell also, you have to interfere in education, in training, in maintenance, and you have to be there. And like I heard that they will build up a military base in United Arab Emirates. Also, that means the country, like say United States, who sell weapons to the other army, has influence inside those armies. There is no doubt about this. And I was talking about Syria the other day, and I said the only country, maybe America doesn't have any influence in it, and Syria, because they don't have any relation with the Syrian
Yeah,
army,
definitely.
so
And
they don't have any
and the
influence.
relation between the supplier and the demander of such arms is a long-term relation. You
Yes.
have to keep on supplying with the maintenance parts,
course.
maybe, and so
Of course,
yeah.
of
So
course.
or else the arms would be futile.
You need ammunitions, you need spare parts.
Definitely.
If the provider, you know, make an embargo, like the French made an embargo on Lebanon in 1990. I was military attaché in Paris, I remember, and we did work very hard to take off this embargo in 1993, because 70% of the Lebanese weapons were French, and we didn't have spare parts, we didn't have ammunition. You know, it's very important to mention this.
Yeah, sure. Back to Dr. George Labaky. Dr. George, what are the underlying reasons for the arms race in the Middle East, especially that the Middle East is one, or it is the most militarized region in the world?
Yes, first of all, I have to mention that arms sales are guided by economic reasons first. Then, of course, by strategic reasons, by political reasons, by technological concerns to dominate countries, to make them dependent on suppliers. Yani, a country now is dependent when it doesn't produce its food, when it does not produce its industrial goods.
It doesn't have sufficiency.
When it does not have the high tech. So this shows up clearly in the arms field. If they sell you the aeroplanes, the most sophisticated ones, and if you don't have the spare parts, your army is mobilized.
Sure.
To get back to your question, I think in the Middle East we have a number of conflicts. Since the 20th century and until today, of course. Of course, we have the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is almost 1 century old conflict with different wars. Then we should not underlook also the wars between the different Arab countries.
But apparently this conflict doesn't justify this arms race, because the arms are not being used for this cause.
If they are not being used or misused, this has to do, I think, with the political decision making, with the different regimes, with their strategies to attack Israel.
But it is a justification. They can use it for buying their arms, maybe.
Yes, I think here we have to accept that some Arab leaders had dreams to become leaders of the Arab world, and they looked more at the image than really buying what is really necessary to undertake a war. So it was a matter often of a prestige than real efficiency. And this has appeared in different wars and conflict with Israel until recently, when, as you know, as of 2006 and 2000, in fact, Israel started being beaten by guerrilla resistance movements, in fact, not by states, usually. Exactly. So you have also the inter-Arab conflicts. If we go back to the 60s, the Egyptian intervention in Yemen, and also after what is called the Arab Spring. We have reservations about that, but we have also strategic and Arab countries claiming to play a major role in the Middle East, especially when it comes to Syria. You have the Gulf countries, you have Egypt, all these, and also you have quote unquote the conflict with Iran and the rivalry, at least, between the Gulf countries and Iran, that is also pushing the Gulf countries to really spend billions in buying arms that are not justified in terms of need and, of course, in terms of efficiency. So I think all these are very important. Plus, internally, now,
because
if I take the Syrian conflict, it's an opportunity for sellers, arms sellers, to sell arms for both sides.
For the oppositions and for the regime
we have
itself.
seen that the Gulf countries are spending billions to buy arms. It's not anymore a secret, to fuel the Syrian conflict, instead of trying to look for a peaceful solution that has to be found.
Many observers and commentators say that many of the Arab states' leaders have arrived to their positions without having that credibility, or their presence in their positions doesn't represent the people's will. That's why they have to be highly militarized. So this is one of the justification, according to some observers. Neither you nor nor General Jaber has mentioned that. Isn't it an underlying reason in this opinion?
Definitely, you know my opinion. Of course, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So when you have a dictatorship, there is no accountability.
Okay,
and
we will have deeper insights about
you have problems.
Definitely.
So this is one of among the problems that finally now are appearing.
We'll go in more depth about your insights regarding this question right after the break. A break, and we'll be back.
Wherever those are persecuted, that place we tackle case by case.
Cases where we believe that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Hello again to Global Insight. Before the break, Dr. George Labaky, you were saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely. So this is one of the justification for being highly militarized in the Arab states.
Also, I have to add the rivalries between Arab leaders. Some biographies or some archives have been unveiled recently. And it shows that in the Arab leaders were fighting, in fact, for supremacy in the Arab world at any cost. This arm race is one of the means they have used. Also, you have the influence of superpowers. They have lobbied these countries to buy arms, useful or unuseful. And because they sought support before superpowers, Europeans and usually the US or the USSR, when it was still live, in return, they had to sign up a number of contracts, commercial and sales contract. Also, I have to add one thing. It is known, at least based on my readings, that arms sales contracts gives room to lucrative commissions.
Yeah, definitely. It's a fact.
And we go back to my story of corruption. So in the environment of decision makers, you have a lot of brokers who are after nice commissions.
Just if I may add something, The Guardian reported that one of the British arms manufacturers has given a Saudi prince a 75 or a $150 million approximately as part of a British arms deal. So this was a commission, solely a commission. Yeah. So this supports your point.
Based on my readings, all the means are used.
Yeah.
So here they use money, bribery. Other means are used from pornography to any type of pressure. Again, to get to these countries to sign contracts. So, and it seems this will be always part of the game. So where are we from what General Jaber mentioned at the beginning, from the noble aim of armies to really defend their countries?
Okay, back to General Jaber. General Jaber, Iran's nuclear program, according to many observers and commentators, sparked nuclear arms race throughout the Arab world. What are your comments regarding that?
I think if you say again, please, your question about nuclear power of Iran. Iran nuclear program.
That Iran's nuclear program sparks nuclear arms race throughout the Arab world. So the many Arab states use the justification of having nuclear power programs in Iran to go further in their arms race. What's your opinion?
It's not the Arab countries who do this. This is America who try to fear them and to create a new potential enemy instead of Israel. Frankly, Iran became the potential enemy to the...
Is it a potential or a real enemy nowadays?
No, it's a potential enemy.
Potential.
It's not a real enemy. Iran never threatened any Arab countries, especially the Gulf countries. Sometimes...
no, I'm saying whether it is a real enemy as perceived by some Arab states. I'm not stating that it is a real enemy.
No, they believe, they hate Iran, they fear Iran also. And they buy weapons in order to face Iran, not to start a war against Iran, because they know it will be destructive, for them. But America is taking advantage from this state of mind, from this psychological situation in their minds, and also to sell them weapons and to tell them that your potential enemy or your enemy is not Israel, is Iran. And also from time to time they start to remember that Iran did occupy 2 or 3 the island in Tomb, Kubra, Tomb, Sughra in the Emirates, and they forgot that it was the Shah who did occupy and considered this Iranian territory when the United Arab Emirates became independent, when the British left that area. And it's not the Iranian Revolution who did invade those countries later on. It's really stupid. If you look at that region, you find that Iran never threatened those countries, but America is taking advantage from this situation in order only to sell them weapons. When America will be in good relation with Iran, and to be clear, and we always said this, and I was in the United States 2 months ago, and I hear from high, ranking people who are really wise, and they said, which is the most important, strategic interest for United States is to have good relation with Iran, because United States respect Iran, and and consider the Arabs the follower to America, whether, you know, America doesn't make any effort, you know.
Do you anticipate a potential good relations or potential talks between the US and the Iranians in the presence of the sanctions which are escalating more and more?
Believe me, the problem between the United States and Iran is not at all the nuclear program, only the position of Iran and the foreign policy, especially toward Israel. If any responsible in Iran would say, make only one single statement, would say, for example, Israel is not our enemy, like Mr. Morsi said 3 months ago, and this it will change everything.
But Mr. Morsi, despite having said this statement, he was ousted from.
Yes, I know this. For this reason, Iran is not ready to make such a statement. But I am trying to put a hypothetical case, and it was discussed in Washington, and it was written in Washington Post that Iran, if Iran would say, I am not enemy to anyone, and especially to Israel, United States will go to Iran to help Iran to build up a military nuclear program at this time. And you have to remember, this nuclear program started in Iran in the late 70s when the Shah was there.
Yeah,
and it was
before
built
the
up
1979,
no,
exactly.
It was built up by the Americans. Now I'm talking about the Arabs. Arabs, you know, are convinced, are not convinced, are trying to show that Iran is their enemy and to buy weapons to face Iran. Believe me, it will not be, you know, it will not protect them, the Arabs, if they will, for example, obey or obey United States, or will be under temptation to provoke any aggression against Iran. If you remember when Israel tried to threaten Iran, we heard, just to hear, we are not sure about it, that one Arab countries in the Gulf said that Israel can use, for example, their sky, for example, to fly over the country if they want to go to Iran. But they did deny it the next day because they know it's very dangerous. In any case, if Israel Israel or United States will invade Iran, and the Americans know this, the Arab countries who will cooperate with this aggression or this invasion will pay very, very expensive price. I'm talking military point of view.
Yeah.
And now we are talking about the military potential. Those Arab countries who did pay hundreds of billions, you know, for those weapons, like Dr. Labaky said, some of them, they were not useful and they didn't use them, and some they misused them.
But they are keeping them for a potential cause.
No, they will be scrapped.
They will be rusty.
They will be scrapped. In a few years, you know, after 5 years, they will pay also billions to buy a new generation, which will not be competitive to the Israeli technology.
Because what they have is already obsolete.
Yes,
yeah?
yes. Yeah. They put them now in their barracks, and they will be scrapped. Yeah. And we in Lebanon, you know, I made many conferences and we wrote many articles. And yesterday, we were talking about it, you know, in a conference, that if we want to build up a Lebanese army, why don't we ask those Arabs who have many stocks, you know, in their barracks, if they can give the Lebanese army some weapons, which they paid $1 billion in the late 90s, you know, and maybe 80s. Also, I have to mention something very important here, you know, because I am aware of this kind of contract. Sometimes many countries, and maybe the Gulf countries, now they started to buy weapons from Russia. The question is why. I remember 6 years ago, and I know that King Abdullah bin Abdul Aziz went to Moscow 5 years or 6 years ago, and he did sign a protocol of $10 billion weapons from Russia. And the first, you know, this year, you know, 3 months ago, arrived a great quantity of those weapons from Russia. Those weapons from Russia would be followed by Russian, expert, for training. And if you ask the question why Russia, and what is the position of the United States?
We'll ask why Russia, after having some comments from Dr. George Labaky regarding another perspective of this issue. Many Western countries and the superpowers brag about their call for human rights, for respecting human rights. However, they are selling weapons, for example, to Turkey, which were sold by the US, and these weapons were used against the Kurds in one of the worst human rights violations. In addition, they are selling weapons to Bahrain, and these weapons are being used to suppress the Bahraini people, among many other examples. How can this paradoxical situation be justified?
Again, as I said at the beginning, it's based on pure interests. Yani the moral values comes second. And the strategic concerns of the United States make that a number of countries, a number of regimes are tolerated, even if they have a very bad human rights record. You have mentioned some countries. We can add a lot to the list.
You can.
We have all the issues of, what about the issue of democracy in the Gulf? Why we want to introduce, we have, it's very amazing to see a number of regimes working very hard to introduce democracy in Syria, while they never witnessed any elections.
Democracy is being violated in their
history.
Yeah, monarchy, because they have absolute monarchy.
Well, we can have constitutional monarchy.
But they are having absolute monarchy, as you've named it before.
So this is one example. We can take a lot of terrible wars recently.
So just going back to the Gulf example, you mean that the supply of weapons and arms to these Gulf states helps in violation, or contributes to the violation of democracy in these countries?
At least they don't ask or they don't request these countries to bring the same change they are requesting from other countries to do. I think if we have to go to democracy, it has to be the concern of Western powers all over the world, not only in specific countries.
And when the expenditure is high on being militarized, then the expenditure on education and other social services would be minimal as well. So this...
in the Gulf countries, as you know, they are very rich in oil revenues. But other countries, they suffer from that. They suffer a lot. And this is one of the reasons why many African countries remained very poor, because they overspent on military that really they did not need. Of course, armies are important to defend national territories.
Definitely.
But as Professor, you know that economically, we cannot consider that to be a plus, at least when you buy arms. If I compare with arms sales between Europe and the US, they always involve technology and labor transfer, which is not the case with third world countries.
Further insights about this topic, among many others, will be right after the final break. A break, and we'll be back.
Pollution and climate change, medicine manipulation, genetically modified food, the destruction of wildlife, and corporate exploitation. These are all part of the new terrorism threatening our future.
Eco-terrorism, global awakening to a world under threat.
Hello again to Global Insight. General Jaber, before I've had the last intervention from Dr. Labaky before the break, you were talking about some underlying reasons which should justify the high militarization in the Middle East. You had some more points to elaborate on. You can go ahead, please.
Yes, in the Middle East, like other countries, only because now we are focusing on the Middle East and the Arab countries. and in general, all totalitarian regimes, you know, for example, let me say that they spend a lot of money for weapons. If they do not have money, for example, only because the head of state in those regimes believes that the army belongs to him, and first priority for him is to protect his regime. So the potential enemy become his people, then maybe another enemies. The weapons they are buying weapons for prestige, like Doctor said, and sometimes to protect themselves and to show forces for any neighbors, or if they have any potential enemy, to defend their countries against the potential enemies. But in some Arab countries, and especially in the Gulf, they buy weapons for political reasons, and also, you know, like they sign contract like a settlement in a way or another. In fact, they do not need those weapons. I was telling you, when Saudi Arabia did sign a contract with $10 billion with Russia, and I said, why Russia? Because to have good relation with Russia and economic relation with Russia, of course, after the green light of the United States, Russia is very happy to sell, and Saudi Arabia is very happy to buy. And of course, it's very difficult maybe on the land, and especially inside the army, because you change training. When you buy weapons from different countries, you have to change the training, the education, and the language. You know, of course, myself, I have experience. I have been trained in France in many military schools. Then I went to America. We Lebanese, we have, you know, two educations. We do understand French and we do understand English. But some Arab countries who did buy from Russia, from China, from United Kingdom, for example, I think they do have problem in the training and also to understand, and they need time to be familiar with those weapons. Anyway, they buy those weapons sometimes for political reasons, to put them in the barracks, and that's it.
And maybe they can outsource some labors whenever they need to use them.
Yes, yes, of course. And yeah, but also there is very important one. You cannot allocate those weapons or sell those weapons to another country without the permission of the first seller and the first provider, because we have this experience. We did ask some Arab countries to give Lebanon some weapons. They have to, we need to have the green light of the seller, who is United States, for example, or United Kingdom. France maybe will accept, will give this green light if some Arab country they want take off of their weapons and give it as a grant to Lebanon, for example. It's very important. Anyway, and Dr. Labaky was talking also about the profit and the commission. And the
the lucrative profits,
yeah,
as Dr. Labaky has named it. Yeah.
No, this is big business. I know from the beginning. Many figures in the Arab world started to make a huge fortune in the Gulf before they were not, from the royal families, for example, but now they are out because the royal families started to learn, because, and to take advantage of this. In many countries, I'm talking about poor countries, rich countries. In Africa, for example, based on my experience and my personal contact, I know very poor countries want to buy weapons and want to take profit, and all the generals. And we are not in a position now to name those countries. This a huge market, is very complicated. Also, is different. There is big difference, big and a huge difference in also selling weapons to a state or selling weapons to insurgent. Selling weapons to insurgent, it's against the law of the United Nations. And now what happened in Syria? We learned that $1 billion has been paid to sell weapons, to send weapons to the insurgent in Syria. what is the position or what is the position of the international law or the United Nations?
Dr. General, I'll address this question to Dr. George Labaky, who can answer from a legal perspective, especially as you've just mentioned, the problem is highly intensified. In fact, there are many treaties, different treaties, Dr. Labaky, to control this arms race. What are these treaties? And if you can emphasize on the Arms Trade Treaty of the year 2012, and the extent to which these treaties are being enforced or not.
Yes, I think at least it has been a concern academically or for those who promote moral values, some politicians to try to promote some kind of moral values in that area. And there has been a big number of treaties. I will just name few. We have more than 50 ones.
The main
ones.
Sure.
Before I comment on to which extent they are applicable or they have been applied.
Definitely.
Basically, of course, we have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, the Strategic Arms Limitations Talks between Russia and the United States, SALT. We have Chemical Weapons Conventions. We have Test Ban Treaties of 1996. We have the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and a very important conference was held on that issue in Beirut last year. We have recently the START Treaty between the US and Russia. We have Biological Weapons Reduction Treaties. All these treaties tried to put some order. Of course, recently, I want to mention, before I comment on really the possibility of implementation of such treaties, there is a treaty called the Arms Trade Treaty. This was passed by the General Security or by the United Nations General Assembly. As you know, it's not binding, but it was ratified by more than 150 countries. One of the major items of that treaty provides that countries should make the necessary to make sure that arms transfer are not permitted to be used in serious violations of international human rights law or humanitarian law or genocide or crimes against humanity, to facilitate terrorist attacks, to violate United Nations Charter's obligations, and to be diverted from the, as General Jaber mentioned, states who were the original recipients of the arms, to adversely affect regional security and to impair poverty reduction. But the problem remains the enforcement. Of course, first of all, there are, as General Jaber mentioned, billions and trillions of dollars of interest within countries. We should not
one market alone, as we've said, is $600 billion in 3 decades. So from one region of the world. So you can imagine how big the industry is.
You see, our manufacturers in Europe, in America, are private businesses, as the General can tell us. And they fight for lucrative contracts also.
Sure,
to develop
and they contribute,
arms.
but the states are highly satisfied in such contracts because this big amount of money contributes to the gross domestic product of these states.
And you know that these arms companies are not included in the WTO. They are outside the WTO treaty. So to keep them as a major source within the hands of states so they can use them without any limitations. To go back to that suggested treaty, of course we have the problem of interest, profit, implementation and verification. Still, we are a long way from seeing the lamb and the wolf living side by side, and it will be a long way before such values really find real implementation. But at least let's consider it let's be positive, optimistic, as a small start in a long, lengthy process.
In fact, I'd like to know from General Jaber, in your opinion, what are the impediments for having such a treaties enforced? And are you optimistic? Or do you share Dr. George Labaky's optimism regarding the implementation or the enforcement of these treaties?
No, no, really. He's very
A
optimistic.
big no, apparently.
Dr. Labaky is optimistic, but based on the experience, I think, and those countries who are the arms sellers, they do have their interest. They can create any conflict or for one single reason to sell their weapons. They create many crises and atmosphere of fear, as we always said, like they are doing in the Gulf, you know, to sell their weapons. Also, you have to go back. I do agree with Dr. Labaky when he said this is a private sector, the weapons industry in the United States. Of course, the cartel of weapons in the United States is private sector, but has a lot of influence on the Congress, on the administration.
Definitely,
And
because
they are
as
accused.
you've named it, it is a cartel. So
Yes, yes.
they are oligopolizing, if you want.
This cartel is accused to not to create the war of Vietnam, but to you know to be responsible about thousands of American soldiers who were killed in Vietnam because they had interest to let the war of Vietnam going on. And you have to discover this. It's not me who said this, but from Pentagon papers who were you know cleared later on in 1980, I think, or 78, after the war of Vietnam. They called Pentagon paper, which had a lot of scandals and the role of those cartels, you know, to put, you know, the oil on the fire in Vietnam. And we're talking now Vietnam and American soldiers who are fighting there. Don't forget the war of Iraq. And also, this cartel has a lot of interest in it. So for this reason, I am not that optimistic.
Based on your observance of what has taken place, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. George Labaky, I highly thank you for your deep insights in this episode, and I'd like to thank General Jaber for his deep insights as well. In fact, the problem of arms race is being highly intensified, as you've mentioned in this episode, and the consequences are being more and more wars, and these wars are being internal wars and regional wars. Hoping that that these treaties, which you and General Jaber have talked about, become more and more implemented and more enforced, I'd like to end this episode, and I highly thank the viewers for having stayed tuned to Global Insight. Keep watching us.